The White House press briefing room in March 2025 was packed with reporters expecting routine questions about domestic policy and international developments. Karoline Leavitt, at 26 years old the youngest White House press secretary in history, had quickly developed a reputation for combative exchanges with the press and dismissive responses to questions about nations the Trump administration considered strategically unimportant. Her youth and social media savvy made her popular with MAGA supporters who appreciated her aggressive defense of Trump policies and her willingness to mock critics. But that same approach, effective against domestic political opponents, would prove disastrous when applied to international diplomacy. The catalyst was an unexpected presence in the briefing room, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He was in Washington for World Bank meetings and had requested credentials to attend the White House daily briefing as an observer. The request was unusual. Foreign leaders didn't typically attend press briefings, but State Department protocol officers saw no reason to deny it. Traoré wanted to understand how the Trump administration's Africa policy was being communicated publicly. What he would witness was a masterclass in how not to conduct international relations. The briefing began routinely. Leavitt took questions about the president's schedule, recent executive orders, and congressional negotiations. Then a reporter from Voice of America asked about recent reports that the administration was considering sanctions on Burkina Faso due to its military government and Russian partnerships. Leavitt's response was characteristically dismissive. Look, Burkina Faso is a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. It's one of the poorest nations in the world. It has a military dictator who overthrew the democratically elected government. And now they're working with Russian mercenaries. This is not a serious country with serious leadership. The president has made clear that America will work with partners who share our values and interests. Burkina Faso under its current military regime does neither. So yes, we're considering all options to ensure that American adversaries don't gain footholds in regions where they can cause problems. But let's be real, Burkina Faso's decisions don't matter much to American interests. They're a minor player making bad choices. The response was stunning in its condescension. Calling a sovereign nation not a serious country and its leader a military dictator, while that leader sat in the briefing room was diplomatically catastrophic. Several reporters who'd noticed Traoré's presence looked uncomfortable. But Leavitt, apparently unaware or unconcerned that Traoré was present, continued. Another reporter followed up, but isn't Burkina Faso's gold sector significant? And doesn't their decision to work with Russia rather than Western partners have strategic implications? Leavitt laughed, an actual dismissive laugh that was captured on camera. Burkina Faso's gold sector? Sure, they have some gold. But they're so poorly governed that they can't even extract it efficiently. They kicked out French companies that knew how to develop resources and replaced them with Russian and Chinese companies that are just going to exploit them worse. It's honestly kind of sad. You have these African military governments that think they're being sovereign and independent by rejecting Western partnerships, but really they're just replacing competent Western partners with incompetent or predatory authoritarian partners. And then they wonder why their countries stay poor. The president looks at situations like Burkina Faso and sees exactly why American leadership matters. Because when countries reject American frameworks, they make themselves worse off. Burkina Faso is a perfect example. They had French support, American development assistance, democratic governance, not perfect, but functional. They threw all that away for military rule and Russian mercenaries. And what do they have to show for it? More violence, more poverty, less international support. It's a case study in bad decision-making. The briefing room was uncomfortable now. Several reporters were trying to signal Leavitt that perhaps this level of contempt for a sovereign nation wasn't appropriate. But she was on a roll, playing to her base who appreciated her aggressive dismissal of anything that challenged American primacy. Traoré had been sitting quietly in the back of the briefing room, watching and listening. His expression was calm, but those who knew him could see the controlled anger in his eyes. He'd been called a dictator, his nation called unserious, his people's decisions mocked as stupidity, and his country's sovereignty dismissed as irrelevant, all by a 26-year-old press secretary who had likely never set foot in Africa and was reading talking points someone else had written. He stood and raised his hand. The movement caught Leavitt's attention. She looked at him with slight confusion. He wasn't dressed like the reporters, and she didn't recognize him. Yes? Do you have a question? Her tone was slightly annoyed, as if his presence was an interruption. Traoré spoke clearly, his accent unmistakable. I am Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. The military dictator of the unserious country you've been describing for the past several minutes. I'm here in Washington for World Bank meetings and requested credentials to observe this briefing to better understand American policy communication. I have several questions and corrections regarding your characterizations. The briefing room went completely silent. Leavitt's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, shock, and then a carefully controlled attempt at professional composure. She had just spent 5 minutes mocking a sovereign leader while he sat in the room. Every camera in the room swung to capture Traoré. This was about to become international news. Leavitt attempted damage control. Captain Traoré, I wasn't aware you were present. Those comments were general characterizations of policy concerns, not personal, Traoré interrupted calmly. They were specific characterizations of my country as not serious, my leadership as dictatorial, and my people's decisions as stupid. Those aren't general policy concerns. Those are insults delivered by someone who apparently didn't bother to learn whether the target of those insults was in the room. But since I am here, let me provide some corrections to your characterizations. He didn't wait for permission to continue. First, you called Burkina Faso one of the poorest nations in the world. That's accurate. We are poor. But you framed that poverty as evidence of our bad governance. Let me provide context. Burkina Faso has been poor for 60 years, long before my government, through decades of the democratic governance and Western partnerships you praised. So poverty isn't evidence that my approach is failing. It's evidence that the previous approaches you're advocating also failed to deliver development. Second, you called me a military dictator who overthrew democratically elected government. I led a military intervention that removed a government that was widely seen as corrupt, unable to provide security, and serving foreign interests more than Burkinabe interests. Was that constitutional? No. Was it necessary? The people of Burkina Faso, who you claim to be concerned about, overwhelmingly supported it because they'd lost faith that constitutional processes would deliver the changes needed. You can call that dictatorship. We call it responding to popular demand for change when established processes had failed. He continued without pausing for response. Third, you mocked our decision to work with Russian military advisors as replacing competent Western partners with incompetent or predatory authoritarian partners. Let me provide data on the competence of those Western partners. During 15 years of French military presence advising Burkinabe forces, terrorist incidents in Burkina Faso increased from approximately 50 annually to over 1,500 annually. Territory under government control decreased from 90% to 60%. Internally displaced persons increased from near zero to over 2 million. Those are French military's own assessment data. That's the competence you're praising. In the 18 months since we restructured our security approach with Russian advisory support, terrorist incidents have decreased by approximately 35%, territorial control has increased to 75%, and over 200,000 displaced persons have returned home. So when you mock our decision to work with Russians as incompetent, you're ignoring that Russian-advised approaches have produced better security outcomes in 18 months than French-advised approaches produced in 15 years. That's not incompetence. That's improvement. Leavitt tried to interject. Captain Traoré, I think there's been a misunderstanding. There's been no misunderstanding. You called my country unserious, mocked my leadership, and dismissed my people's sovereignty as irrelevant to American interests. Those characterizations were clear. What's happening now is that you're uncomfortable that the person you were mocking is present to respond. But since I am present, let me continue with corrections. He pressed on. Fourth, you said Burkina Faso's decisions don't matter much to American interests and that we're a minor player making bad choices. This reveals fundamental misunderstanding of how international relations work. Burkina Faso's decisions about security partnerships, resource management, and economic development matter enormously to Burkinabe interests, which is what should guide our decision-making. The fact that they don't matter much to American interests is precisely why we're free to make those decisions based on our assessment rather than American preferences. You framed our irrelevance to American interests as weakness. I frame it as freedom from American pressure. We're not important enough to America for America to successfully coerce us. That's not a problem, that's liberation. Fifth, you mocked African military governments for thinking they're being sovereign and independent by rejecting Western partnerships when really they're replacing competent Western partners with incompetent or predatory authoritarian partners. This framing assumes Western partnerships were competent and beneficial, which the security data I just cited contradicts. It also assumes that sovereignty means choosing between Western and authoritarian partners rather than making independent choices based on national interests. Real sovereignty means we evaluate all potential partners, Western, Chinese, Russian, Turkish, whoever, based on what they offer and what they cost. We work with partners who serve our interests on acceptable terms. We reject partners who don't. That's not replacing one master with another. That's being an actual sovereign nation. Leavitt was visibly struggling now. This wasn't a journalist asking questions she could deflect. This was a head of state systematically dismantling her talking points in front of the entire White House press corps with specific data and arguments she wasn't prepared to counter. And sixth, most importantly, you said, when countries reject American frameworks, they make themselves worse off, and cited Burkina Faso as a case study in bad decision-making. Let me be very clear about this. Burkina Faso spent 60 years following American and French frameworks. We maintained Western-aligned democratic governance, imperfect but functional, as you said. We hosted French military bases. We gave Western companies favorable access to our resources. We followed IMF and World Bank guidance on economic policy. We did everything the American framework prescribed. And the result was persistent poverty, deteriorating security, unfavorable resource contracts, and governments seen as serving external interests rather than Burkinabe interests. That's 60 years of evidence that American frameworks didn't deliver development or security for Burkina Faso. So when we decided to try different approaches, restructuring resource contracts, diversifying security partnerships, prioritizing Burkinabe interests over external preferences, we weren't rejecting proven success. We were abandoning demonstrated failure. And the results so far suggest that our new approach is working better than the American framework did. So the case study in bad decision-making isn't Burkina Faso rejecting American frameworks. It's Burkina Faso following American frameworks for 60 years despite evidence they weren't working. The briefing room was completely silent. Reporters were frantically taking notes. Cameras were focused on Traoré. This was no longer a White House press briefing. It was an African leader delivering an unscheduled lecture on sovereignty and the failures of Western development frameworks to the White House press secretary who'd made the mistake of mocking him. Leavitt attempted to regain control. Captain Traoré, I appreciate your perspective, but I think you're mischaracterizing. Traoré cut her off. I'm not mischaracterizing anything. I'm providing specific data and analysis that contradicts your claims. If you believe my data is wrong, cite competing data. If you believe my analysis is flawed, explain the flaw. But don't tell me I'm mischaracterizing when what I'm actually doing is challenging your unsupported assertions with evidence. He wasn't done. Now, since I'm here and you've been discussing Burkina Faso's policy decisions, let me ask you some questions. You said America is considering all options regarding Burkina Faso because we're working with Russian military advisors. What options specifically? Sanctions? Aid cutoffs? Diplomatic isolation? Because Burkina Faso has already prepared for all of those. We've diversified partnerships specifically so American pressure doesn't force us into compliance. We've built economic resilience so aid cutoffs don't create crises. We've developed security capabilities that don't depend on Western support. So if your options are designed to pressure Burkina Faso into abandoning Russian partnerships and returning to American frameworks, you should know they won't work. We've spent 2 years building resilience against exactly that pressure. Leavitt was clearly out of her depth. I'm not going to discuss specific diplomatic options in a press briefing. Then don't threaten considering all options in a press briefing. If you're not prepared to specify what you're considering, don't use vague threats as rhetorical tools. It makes American policy sound both aggressive and unserious. Aggressive because you're threatening consequences, unserious because you won't specify what they are. Another reporter, sensing this was historic, asked a question. Captain Traoré, you've spent several minutes responding to the press secretary's characterizations of Burkina Faso. Do you think this exchange represents broader problems with American Africa policy? Traoré responded immediately, yes. This exchange perfectly represents the problem. The White House press secretary, representing the American government, characterized Burkina Faso as unserious, our leadership as dictatorial, our decisions as stupid, and our sovereignty as irrelevant to American interests. Those characterizations were delivered with complete confidence despite being contradicted by data, being diplomatically insulting, and being factually wrong about whether the target of the insults was present. That combination, certainty, condescension, and ignorance, is exactly how American Africa policy has functioned for decades. American officials are certain they know what's best for Africa. They're condescending toward African leaders who disagree. And they're ignorant of both African realities and the failures of their own policy prescriptions. The press secretary's performance today is just an unusually public example of that pattern. The only difference is that usually the mocking happens in Washington without African leaders present to respond. Today I happened to be in the room. And I chose to respond rather than let the insults pass unchallenged. Leavitt attempted one final effort to regain control of the briefing. Captain Traoré, I think we should take this conversation offline through proper diplomatic channels rather than continuing to debate policy in a press briefing. Traoré's response was immediate and cutting. You were comfortable debating Burkina Faso's policy in this press briefing when you thought I wasn't here to respond. You called my country unserious, mocked my leadership, and dismissed my people's decisions. You made those characterizations publicly, in front of cameras, as official White House communication. Now that I'm responding with data that contradicts your claims, suddenly you want to move the conversation to private diplomatic channels where there are no cameras and no public accountability. That's not how this works. You made public insults. I'm delivering public corrections. If you want to avoid public corrections in the future, don't make public insults about countries whose leaders might be in the room. The exchange had gone on for nearly 20 minutes. It was clear Leavitt had lost complete control of her own briefing. She made a decision. I think we're going to end the briefing here. Thank you all for coming. She gathered her materials and left the podium quickly, leaving reporters shouting questions about whether the White House stood by her characterizations of Burkina Faso and whether there would be diplomatic consequences for the exchange. Traoré remained in the briefing room for several minutes after, speaking with reporters who wanted follow-up. His message was consistent. The press secretary's comments revealed how American officials actually think about African nations as unserious places with incompetent leaders making stupid decisions. Usually those thoughts stay private or get expressed in ways that maintain diplomatic courtesy. Today they were expressed bluntly. And I responded bluntly. If that creates diplomatic tension, the tension was created by the insults, not by my response to them. Within an hour, video of the exchange was everywhere. African leader destroys White House press secretary after she mocks his country, became the top story across international media. American progressive outlets used it to criticize the Trump administration's diplomatic incompetence. Conservative outlets defended Leavitt while criticizing Traoré as thin-skinned dictator who can't handle criticism. African media celebrated it as rare example of African leader directly confronting American condescension in American institutional space. 6 hours after the briefing, the White House released a statement attempting damage control. The press secretary's comments during today's briefing were characterizations of policy concerns, not personal insults. The United States values its relationships with all African nations and respects their sovereignty. We continue to have concerns about military governments and authoritarian partnerships in the Sahel region, but those concerns are about policy outcomes, not about the dignity or seriousness of any particular nation. The statement satisfied no one. It didn't retract Leavitt's "not a serious country" comment. It didn't apologize for the mocking tone. It simply tried to reframe insults as policy concerns. Traoré responded via Twitter 2 hours later. White House statement says press secretary's comments were policy concerns, not personal insults. But calling Burkina Faso "not a serious country" is definitionally a personal insult about national dignity, not a policy concern about specific decisions. And mocking African leaders for thinking they're being sovereign when they make independent choices is condescension, not policy analysis. The statement confirms what the briefing revealed. American officials believe they can insult African nations and then claim they were just expressing policy concerns. We reject that framework. Insults are insults. And will respond to them as such. The next day's White House briefing was tense. Leavitt opened by addressing the previous day's exchange without naming Traoré. Yesterday there was an exchange in this briefing room that has gotten a lot of attention. I want to be clear about what happened. A foreign leader was present in the briefing room, which is unusual but not unprecedented. During routine policy discussion, some characterizations were made that he took personally. I regret if diplomatic norms were not observed as they should have been in that context. However, the substance of American concerns about military governments, authoritarian partnerships, and governance challenges in parts of Africa remains unchanged. The President believes strongly in supporting democratic governance and partnerships that serve both American interests and African development. That position isn't going to change based on one contentious exchange. A reporter immediately asked, "Ms. Leavitt, you called Burkina Faso not a serious country and laughed about their gold sector. Do you stand by those characterizations?" I stand by American policy concerns about the trajectory of governance and partnerships in Burkina Faso under military rule. The specific language used yesterday may not have reflected the diplomatic courtesy that should characterize official communications, but the underlying concerns are valid. Another reporter, Captain Traoré, cited specific data showing security improvements after Burkina Faso ended its partnership with French forces and began working with Russian advisors. Do you dispute that data? Leavitt was uncomfortable. I'm not going to litigate specific security statistics in a press briefing. Our intelligence and defense agencies have their assessments. What I will say is that short-term tactical improvements don't necessarily indicate long-term strategic success. And partnerships with Russian mercenaries have proven problematic across Africa in ways that may not be immediately visible in security statistics. But Captain Traoré's point was that 15 years of French military partnership produced deteriorating security, and 18 months of Russian advisory support produced improving security. If the data supports that, doesn't it undermine the claim that Western partnerships are superior? Look, there are lots of ways to interpret security data. Different methodologies, different time frames, different definitions of success. What doesn't change is that democratic governance, respect for human rights, and partnerships with accountable professional militaries produce better long-term outcomes than military rule and partnerships with forces that don't have those accountability mechanisms. That's the President's position and mine. But the briefing had become about the previous day's disaster. Every question returned to Leavitt's mocking of Burkina Faso and Traoré's demolition of her claims. After 30 minutes, she ended the briefing early for the second day in a row. 1 week after the exchange, Politico published a detailed account based on interviews with State Department officials who were horrified by Leavitt's performance. The article quoted an anonymous senior diplomat: "You don't call sovereign nations not serious in public briefings. You don't mock their leaders. You don't laugh about their economic challenges. And you especially don't do any of those things when the leader you're mocking is sitting in the room." This was a masterclass in diplomatic incompetence. The fact that an African military captain then systematically destroyed our talking points with data we couldn't refute just made it worse. We looked simultaneously arrogant and ignorant. That's the worst combination in international relations. 2 weeks after the briefing, at an African Union meeting, multiple African leaders privately told Traoré they were grateful he'd responded as directly as he had. One West African president said, "We've all sat through meetings where American officials condescend to us, mock our decisions, and dismiss our sovereignty. Usually we smile and take it because we need American aid or support. You had the independence to call it out publicly. That matters. It shows other African leaders that we don't have to accept that treatment." Another leader asked practical questions. Did confronting the press secretary damage your relationship with the U.S. government? Are there consequences? Traoré's response was realistic: probably some damage, yes. American officials don't like being publicly challenged, especially by leaders from countries they consider unimportant. But the relationship was already defined by American condescension and pressure to abandon our partnerships with Russia and China. The briefing room exchange didn't create that dynamic, it just made it public. And honestly, I'd rather have an honest adversarial relationship where both sides are clear about disagreements than a fake partnership where America pretends to respect our sovereignty while actually expecting subordination. 3 weeks after the briefing, Leavitt gave an interview to a conservative outlet where she was asked about the Burkina Faso incident. Her response attempted to reframe herself as the victim: it was an ambush. A foreign military leader came to a press briefing, heard policy characterizations he didn't like, and then turned it into a confrontation. That's not normal diplomatic behavior. Normal diplomatic behavior would be to raise concerns through proper channels, not to grandstand in a press briefing. But he wanted the attention and the viral moment. And liberal media gave it to him because they love any opportunity to make this administration look bad. The response only extended the story. Traoré responded via social media: "I didn't ambush anyone. I requested credentials and attended a public briefing." The press secretary chose to spend 5 minutes mocking my country, apparently unaware or unconcerned that I was present. When I responded with data contradicting her claims, she called it an ambush. But the real issue isn't that I was in the room, it's that she said things about Burkina Faso she couldn't defend when challenged. If her characterizations were accurate and defensible, my presence wouldn't have mattered. The fact that my presence turned into a confrontation just proves the characterizations were indefensible insults, not serious policy analysis. 6 months after the briefing room exchange, when international relations scholars analyzed Trump administration Africa policy, the Leavitt-Traoré confrontation was featured prominently as an example of how not to conduct public diplomacy. One analysis noted, the exchange revealed several pathologies of American Africa policy. First, casual contempt, the assumption that African nations and leaders can be mocked without consequence because they're too weak to respond. Second, ignorance. Leavitt's characterizations were contradicted by data she apparently hadn't reviewed. Third, double standards, calling African military governments dictatorships while maintaining close partnerships with Gulf monarchies and other authoritarian governments that serve American interests. Fourth, inability to handle being challenged. When Traoré responded with evidence, the response was to end the briefing rather than engage substantively. Captain Traoré's performance demonstrated that some African leaders are now willing and able to publicly challenge American condescension rather than quietly accepting it. 1 year after the briefing room shutdown, a journalist asked Traoré about the exchange and whether he regretted the confrontational approach. His response was characteristically direct. "I don't regret responding to insults with facts. The press secretary called my country unserious, mocked my leadership, and dismissed my people's sovereignty. Those weren't policy disagreements, they were insults. And they were delivered with such casual contempt that she apparently didn't think it mattered whether I was in the room. When I revealed I was present and responded with data showing her characterizations were wrong, she claimed I'd ambushed her. But the only ambush was her discovery that sometimes the targets of American mockery are in position to respond. That's not something I regret. That's something American officials should anticipate. African leaders are increasingly unwilling to accept condescension quietly. We'll challenge it. Publicly if necessary. And we'll do so with evidence rather than just complaint." The briefing room exchange wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview of how African-American relations will function going forward when American officials fail to show basic respect.